to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. On June 27, 1839, La Amistad, a maritime vessel chartered out of Spain, departed from the port of Havana, Cuba, transporting 49 African men, slaves who had been kidnapped from Sierra Leone, from Havana to Puerto Principe on the other side of Cuba, on orders of the governor of Cuba. This was a tedious, mundane job for the sailors of the Amistad, as they were used to transporting slaves, sugar, and rum in the slave trade triangle from Europe to Africa to Cuba and the Americas. This particular run from port to port in Cuba should only take about 4 days, so they brought with them only 4 days of rations. But on day 4, one of the slaves, led by Joseph Cinque, broke their bonds and escaped. Kidnapped from Africa, their goal was to return home. They overtook the crew of the vessel, killing the cook and the captain. 2 Africans were killed as well. Overpowering the 2 remaining crewmen, the Africans commanded them to sail the Amistad back to Africa so they could be reunited with their wives and children and restore their families that had been ripped apart. But the crewmen were more skilled at navigation than the Africans. Instead of heading to Africa, they sailed up north, up the coast of the United States, eventually winding up off the coast of Connecticut. The boat was spotted by Thomas Gedney, captain of the USS Washington, who tried to take possession of the Africans and claim them as his property, citing maritime law for salvage rights, claiming the Africans were not people, but property to be confiscated and possessed, just as anything else that would be found in the ship's hold. For a time, the Africans were jailed, while U.S. courts of law tried to determine their legality, their fate, and their very humanity. The Africans were charged with murder for killing the ship's captain and cook in their attempt to gain freedom, but even more troubling, their very worth and identity were put on trial. Were they human beings, God's children, created to love and be loved, or cargo to be salvaged by American pickers? This is where the United Church of Christ came in, acting in the way of foolishness, according to their contemporaries. The Congregationalist churches of the United States, one of the predecessor denominations of the United Church of Christ, took great steps to give comfort to the Amistad Africans. They raised money to pay for their legal fees. They fed them, they clothed them, they even housed them in their own homes. They bandaged their wounds and they made them feel whole. Their mission was to restore the dignity of these oppressed Africans. For 2 years, this was the central focus of the Congregational churches of New England, now the United Church of Christ, ensuring that justice would be realized with these unfortunate victims, but even more so, assuring that restorative justice was realized in their souls. The Congregational churches of New England led an organized movement for over 2 years to be open and affirming to these men, to proclaim that these men are not property, that they are loved by their Creator, and that their black lives matter. The victims of the Amistad schooner was the focus of these churches for several years. Well, the Africans were exonerated by circuit court, but U.S. President Martin Van Buren, desiring re-election and influenced a little bit by Andrew Jackson, fearing public reaction and what turmoil this ruling might have in the fragile state of slavery in the U.S. at the time, ordered the district attorney to appeal the case further. He did, and the Africans won that trial as well. Martin Van Buren then ordered the case to be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was. And with former U.S. President and Congregationalist John Quincy Adams as their attorney arguing before the U.S. Supreme Court, the Africans won their case for a third time. On March 9th, 1841, the Africans were finally declared free men, 180 years ago this week. The Congregational churches contributed thousands of dollars to the cause to see justice and dignity restored. After the trial was over, they also raised the funds needed to send the Africans back home, back to their families in Sierra Leone, families that had been ripped apart by prejudice and greed and were finally reunited. Well, the history of the United Church of Christ is filled with stories such as this about how our predecessor denominations stood up against injustices to restore justice in a world of narcissism and greed, even when their contemporaries said it was foolish of them to do so. From the German evangelicals who came to this country who fought against slavery to the delegates gathered at General Synod in 2005 and issued an opinion piece that encouraged people to think about the issue of marriage equality, the United Church of Christ has always been about restoring people who have been disenfranchised by the establishment, even when it means conflicting with established laws or popular opinion. I remember the backlash in 2005 that resulted from that General Synod resolution. That resolution, causing such controversy, simply called on churches of the United Church of Christ to discuss the issue of marriage equity, and if they found themselves in favor of it, to make their opinion known to their legislatures. But above all, it called on people to treat each other with kindness and respect, whether they agreed with marriage equity or not. This was a bold stand for the United Church of Christ 16 years ago. We were the first mainline denomination to make such a stand for equality, and many people called us foolish for doing so. It would take another 10 years for public opinion to come around to the point of marriage equality being the law of the land, but we stood up for it first, before it was the popular thing to do. We stood up for it when it was foolish by cultural standards, because we, as the United Church of Christ, knew that God's ways often seem foolish by cultural standards, but God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. When our German evangelical forebears took a stand for the abolition of slavery, they were called foolish. Having seen oppression by the King of Prussia and fleeing to this country to avoid forced conscription and religious persecution, they had little tolerance for seeing others oppressed. These German ancestors of ours took bold stances against slavery, and some were hanged because of it. One church here in Missouri that I know of was without a pastor for several weeks because he continued to preach against slavery, and the slaveholders down the road organized a lynch mob to go after him. His congregation members had to keep him in hiding for fear of his life. Some may have called his abolitionist stand foolish, but he knew that God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. And then we have those foolish Congregationalists. For 2 years, their sole purpose as churches was to house and harbor those Africans, those Amistad Africans. Foreigners run afoul of the law. They use their resources to fight that battle all the way to the Supreme Court to send those Africans back home to unite their families when they won. These actions seemed awfully foolish to their contemporaries, wasting so much time and money on people they didn't even know. I'm sure that some members of the church complained that they were foolish for spending so much time on one issue and not focusing on other things. But they knew that God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. These words that Sue Ann read today were written by the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Christian church in Corinth. They were the words of wisdom that needed to be heard in that context, for that Christian church in Corinth was nestled in a very difficult place. Paul founded this church around 50 A.D., a story that is recounted in the book of Acts. They were situated in a Greco-Roman community that valued self-promotion, self-pleasure, arrogance, and greed over the humility and servanthood that Jesus advocated. So trying to share the wisdom of Jesus' good news was a difficult sale in that time and place. But the good news of Jesus Christ won many followers, and the Christian church in Corinth began to thrive. Paul left them to their own devices and traveled on to Ephesus, where he began a church there. But he soon heard word of division in Corinth, and he wrote this letter that we have today. He wrote this letter back to them, appealing for unity in the midst of conflict. He encouraged them to follow the ways of Jesus, even though their community regarded them as foolish. Why should they be humble when Greek gods called them to be arrogant? Why should they be meek when Greek culture called them to be prideful? Why should they be charitable to the lowly when Greek society called them to subject the lowly to tyranny? Why should they follow such foolish teachings from Jesus? Well, this is what Paul is reminding them in this letter back to them, reminding them that the ways of Jesus seem foolish to those who are perishing, but to those who have received the new life that Jesus Christ offers, they understand that the ways of Jesus are not foolish at all. They are life-giving. They are life-affirming. Those who follow the good news of Jesus Christ understand that the way that leads to the cross does not lead to death. The way that leads to the cross leads to life. Standing up for Jesus is not always easy. Standing up for Jesus makes some people mad. It also means putting up with mockery, as some people call you foolish. We at Columbia United Church of Christ understand this, for we went through it when we voted to follow Jesus' example and proclaim ourselves an open and affirming congregation of the United Church of Christ. There were those who got mad because we decided to follow Jesus. There were those who called us foolish because we chose to follow Jesus. But like that Christian church in Corinth, we chose to follow Jesus and we persevered. Following Jesus is not always easy, and though it is foolish to those who are perishing, to those who are saved, it is the power of God. But you know what? God's foolishness is not just for the big things, like declaring yourselves an open and affirming congregation, calling for the abolition of slavery, and giving comfort to Amistad Africans. God's way of foolishness is also on our part every day as well, in our everyday choices, the little things in life that call for God's foolishness in our lives every day. I had somebody point out to me the other day that it's easy to change the world. It's much harder to have goodwill for the person who cuts you off on the highway. In other words, as Christians, we put a lot of energy into those big things, but when it comes to the little everyday choices in life, we sometimes forget to put God first. Like when we have the opportunity to read the Bible or pray, and we choose to binge Netflix instead. Like when we have the choice to go to church or do secular activities instead, and we choose the perishing ways of the world. Like when we have the opportunity to act charitably towards our neighbor or a stranger, and we just don't have the time to do it. Amistad moments are in our lives every day. We have the choice to be God's fools or puppets of the world, And so often we choose puppets over fools. Well, today is Amistad Sunday in the United Church of Christ. On this day every year, we remember the story of the Amistad and its prominent place in the congregational part of our history. We remember that our ancestors said Black Lives Matter 180 years ago in their words and deeds, not because white lives don't matter, but because black lives were the ones being threatened and needed to be lifted up. But as we celebrate Amistad Sunday, we must also remember how revolutionary their stance was, how dangerous their prophecy was. In a world that was tenuously balancing the albatross of slavery with the desire for liberty and justice for all, making a proclamation that Black Lives Matter was quite prophetic, culturally foolish, and unashamedly Christian. This foolish wisdom, this way of foolishness, is part of our heritage and faith, part of the Christian Church of Corinth and the Congregationalist Church of Connecticut and the General Synod of the United Church of Christ and Columbia United Church of Christ, as they and we, all who are being saved, stand for Jesus in the midst of a perishing world. And we who are being saved are called to take this foolishness into our lives as well. As Paul implored the Christian church in Corinth, Paul's words reached through the ages to implore us as well. Take God's foolish ways into your heart, into your life. Make the choices that are bold and culturally foolish, and let the power of God and the wisdom of God flourish, both in the big and the small choices in life. This morning, we talked about what it means to be a prophet. An Old Testament prophet did not predict the future. An Old Testament prophet spoke the truth to power, even when it was difficult or dangerous to do so. But to that definition, I'm going to give you a new word to add to that definition. Let's add the word foolish to that. A true prophet speaks the truth to power, even when it is foolish to do so. May we all be prophetic in our corner of God's kingdom, and may we all speak the truth to power, and may we all follow the way of foolishness. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Amen. Please rise and join together in our hymn.